Well, welcome everybody to tonight's topical call on evidence-based practices to support kids with emotional disabilities. We're really happy that Michelle Woodcock from the Department of Public Instruction is joining us tonight. And if you didn't get a chance, she also did one earlier in the month, which is up on our Family Voices website. On behavioral supports for children. So that recording and the slides are also there. So Michelle, without further ado, I'm just gonna let you take it away.
All right, well, I'd love to. As you said, I'm Michelle Woodcock. I'm a special education coordinator with the Department of Public Instruction. And I'm, just in case things get bumpy, I'm in a hotel room tonight because we're going to be in some schools tomorrow, which I'm excited about. And Wi-Fi, it hopefully will hold and everything will be perfect. But if not, we'll deal with it and be on as quick as I can. And so today we're going to talk about evidence-based practices to support kids. And I'm going to explain to you the why of where we've come to kids with emotional disabilities, but that's really the focus of kind of what we were researching and wanting to share. But again, hoping that if it can help these students, it helps them all. This is I've done this presentation several times before. It's always been to teachers. And so I'm trying my best. I want to say more children because that's more your aim. But if I say students, that's what I'm meaning. And so one of the things I don't think a lot of people know is that as a state, we have a requirement to provide data on 17 different federal indicators to the Office of Special Education Programs every year. And so I know this gets really small. And when Deneen sends out the slides, there's that link to the IDC or the IDEA Data Center. And you can click on that link and it will bring this up in nice big print where you can see it. But these are things that every year, it's due the February 1st, we have to submit data of how we're doing as a state around the areas of graduation is indicator 1, dropout is indicator 2, our dropout rate as a state. Things about how we're doing in the state assessments, how we're doing with preschool outcomes, how we are doing with family parent involvement, how we are doing as far as our state systemic improvement plan, which is indicator 17. So really a lot of what brought us to the information you'll hear today has been around indicator 1 on graduation rates for students in our state with disabilities, indicator 2 on the dropout rate for these students, and indicator 17, which is our state systemic improvement plan. So each state is required to have a state systemic improvement plan. And of those 17 indicators, all but one is like dictated of exactly what we have to submit. But our state systemic improvement plan, or SSIP, is our choice. So as a state, we went out to groups of stakeholders. We also have it's called our IDEA Advisory or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We have an advisory council made up of parents, of students, of different community stakeholders. And they give us input around what some of our goals and what they should be. And so the stakeholders we had talked with had said, increasing the graduation rate for students that are identified as having an emotional disturbance, which is our Individuals with Disabilities Education Act term is an emotional disturbance. I know some people prefer emotional disability. We currently use the term that's in the federal regulations. So in this state, we decided that the way we would measure that is looking at the 6-year graduation rate for students having an emotional disturbance. One of the things we know is that sometimes these kids have struggles that mean they may not get all their credits in a given year. So they may need a few additional years to finish school. That's why we went with the 6-year rate. Sometimes some of these students drop out, but the school districts are able to re-engage them and bring them back. So that's the bonus of, instead of just looking at a 4-year graduation rate, which most is typically what we think of with students, to going to that 6-year rate, because students in the state of North Dakota legally have through the age of 21, whether they have disabilities or not, to complete their high school diploma. So I know this is small, and again, those slides will go out, but around our state systemic improvement plan, we created this theory of action of how are we going to increase the graduation rates. And so essentially what this says is that if North Dakota Department of Public Instruction provides leadership, and the way we're going to do that is through providing technical assistance. That means helping teachers, helping our special education units, helping parents, helping anybody related to the schools or community agencies by offering technical assistance, which is presentations or answering questions, through also making sure we allocate resources, which often is funding, but can also be additional things. And that we also provide some relationship building, again, hopefully with parents, as well as all of our school staff and community agencies. Then by doing those things, we should see an increase in some of our graduation rates, building to those lasting results. And I just wanted to point out as well that as part of the North Dakota Department of Public Instruction strategic vision, there's a link to the guidance document at the bottom, but it really basically says that if we can do a lot of these things, so in the blue box, if we can do those things, it's going to help reach the goals that are in the green, which is quality early childhood education, support for safe and healthy behaviors, career awareness and exploration, quality educational personnel, and student-centered instruction. All of those things are especially part of having good, like social, emotional, behavioral health. And so we hope to do that by making sure that our kids can read proficiently by 3rd grade. We're going to try to make sure the students who enter kindergarten have had some preschool exposure and are ready to learn. That we're going to have kids making gains every year, that they're engaged in learning, that they graduate choice ready. If you aren't aware, North Dakota has a choice ready framework, meaning that the kids who are, whether they have disabilities or not, all students would graduate choice ready. And the choice ready framework basically means your child will select from some choices of how they'd want to graduate, which means military ready, workforce ready, career ready, or post-secondary, like to a college ready. Then there's also an alternate choice ready pathway for some of our students who may take the North Dakota alternate assessment, who have a more significant cognitive disability. They graduate alternate choice ready. And there is a category for all students that they complete called essential skills. Essential skills include things like those 21st century skills, the ability to work with people, to have that emotional regulation, self-control, like all those kind of skills are part of being essential skill ready. So we have that foundation of wanting to make sure we're getting those kids choice ready. And some of the ways we do that impact our students graduating in that 6-year time frame. So here is the data we have submitted to the Office of Special Education Programs for these last few years. So I don't know if on this one you see my pointer on the screen or not, but in that top target row, these are the targets. So this is the goal number that we set for the Office of Special Ed Programs. So for 2021, our target was that 62.04% of students with ED or emotional disturbance graduate in 6 years. So our goal is 62.04. In 2021, and this is a little bit tricky to explain because this is called a lag indicator. Essentially, we follow the same cohort of students through those 6 years. And so to collect this data, the 2021 is actually collecting data from the 2019-2020 school year. So in that school year, 58.12% of students identified with an emotional disturbance graduated high school. So this is why our stakeholders really decided this was an area we needed to focus on, because it's 58% of those students identified are graduating. We have to do better. And so our goal, we have to set goals in 5-year cycles. So as you will see, we have a target for 2022 up through 2025. Our goal by 2025 is to get to 67.63% of students with ED graduating. So here's kind of what this looks like in a bar graph. The orange line is our target, where we hope to be. So you will see that our target had kind of gone up and then dropped down. So we have to apply to the Office of Special Ed Programs with what our goal is, what our targets are. And we do it in 5-year chunks. So we just did the target setting for 2020 through 2025. So that's why in 2020, we kind of reset that goal, because what we noticed was like we were really doing well in that 2017, but then we started drifting away a little bit. And so we just wanted to reset our baseline to where we were, and then look at where do we think is realistic to build. Because the hard part is the year we had to reset all these targets and do the stakeholder feedback was right as we hit like the times we were all going home during COVID. And so then when we were setting targets, and we did involve stakeholder groups, we did put it out for public comment on how we set these targets. The one factor we didn't know was, one, how long at that point COVID was going to keep people home, or two, what was going to happen with students when we came back. And so I would say we've taken more of a conservative setting in the first few years. We work with an outside evaluator, is what they are called as far as some of our federal grants and plans. And they had suggested that we set a target of where we'd like to get by 2025, and then kind of maybe keep the same target for like 2 years in a row. So 2020 and 2021, the target was pretty similar, and then we slowly start increasing. So it gave us a little bit of time here to start building some momentum to launch into hopefully a lot more success and see where we're going. So I didn't give you as much long-term history, but I wanted to show you these 3 rates next to each other. So what you will see, the blue line shows you graduation rates for all students in North Dakota. So if we include all those students that would be in this 6-year cohort, as they graduated from high school. So when it was students with and without disabilities all mashed together, we were between 90 and 95% graduating within 6 years. The orange rate are students who are on IEPs. So any student with an IEP from this cohort. And as you can see, there's been a little variation. We did have a little drop that was kind of partially coming out of that COVID time. And they are somewhere in the 75 to 80% range with graduating that percent of students in the 6 years. But then our students with ED are that gray line, and they fluctuate between 55 and I'd say about 60% really on average. And so that is why this has been a targeted group for us. And when we did that 5-year review, we could switch goals, and our stakeholder group said, we have not figured this out yet. We need to work more and work harder. And so we are. We are one of the few states that have selected graduation rates for students. I would say I think all but 5 states are pretty much around their goals focus around proficiency on state assessments. We wanted to look in addition to that to things that would help our students graduate and be successful. So if you didn't see some of the stuff I presented last time, we did talk about the functions of behavior, and that students who have struggles with behavior, actually any of us adults as well, the reason we do behaviors is typically to get or avoid one of these 4 things: sensory, escape, attention, or to get to a tangible item, right? We work to get a tangible item, money. If any of us are in an environment where we feel like it's too loud or overwhelming, we may try to leave the room or go somewhere quiet. That's an escape behavior. So people have behaviors that serve really good purposes, but sometimes they are used at times where it appears that it may not be appropriate for the environment. I would say most of the time for that child or student, it's still serving a purpose for them that is meaningful and important. But our job then is as people who are trying to help support their behavior, is to look at, why is this occurring? Which of these functions is it serving? And how can we find a replacement behavior that's appropriate, that would be beneficial to them, and that we can provide in place of those negative behaviors? And so today we're going to talk about some strategies that we hope that we picked for schools, but I think many of them apply equally well at home, that can be used to help hopefully decrease the number of behaviors and supports that we see, and make things just life better for those kids. That's really what we're after. So as we talk about using evidence-based practices, why do we do it? Well, because the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and within the Council for Exceptional Children Teachers Standards, it says we should be using evidence-based promising practices, and either of those come out of peer-reviewed research. Which leads us to, what is peer-reviewed research? What is that evidence-based? I think many people, I hear some people say, well, if you can find research anywhere that would prove anything. And to a point, yes, you can. But especially as we talk about it in education, I mean, 4 of us teachers could go into a classroom and implement stuff and take data on it and say, here, it's evidence-based, here's what happened. And we could. But ideally, we'd like it to be peer-reviewed, which is research reviewed by qualified and independent reviewers, right? Sometimes if you go onto a website or something, you may see that there's reviews on it, but when you look into it, the company paid for somebody to review their stuff, or they did their own research. And not that it's bad, it just makes us question, would somebody who's outside of that group find the same thing? So ideally, we would find it done by qualified independent reviewers who can vouch for that all the protocols have been followed for good quality research, that the results they find would be able to be replicated. And then I did quote the part of federal regulation where that came from. And so what triggered some of this in our thoughts? So we knew we wanted to increase our graduation rates for students with ED. And as we talked about the need for those evidence-based practices, one thing that kept coming up to me was, again, we're looking at all this evidence-based practice, but if you read through some research, when you read through who makes up the groups they did studies with, sometimes kids with disabilities aren't included in their norming samples or the groups of kids they did the research with. So even if kids with any disability aren't in the group, are kids with an emotional disability in that group? So it led me to do some questioning, and I just luckily got connected to a group that had been doing some research. And I'm not going to go into all the details on these big research studies, but what they did was they started their research before 2019. It was first published in 2019, and they did a mega literature review, which means they really were being highly thorough. So there was a group of several men, and they went through 5,488 articles that were written in peer-reviewed journals. So these were already published research about evidence-based strategies. But then they started asking they asked 3 questions in their research. What strategy was used in that study? How many kids with an emotional, and they classified it as emotional behavioral disorder, because some states do put behavioral in that ED title. North Dakota follows the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act definition. Some states do broaden it and include behavior. So this research included emotional and behavioral disorders. And then they also asked, after the research was done, what did these authors designate as being evidence-based or a promising practice? So they started with 5,488 articles. And as they looked at, did it answer those 3 questions? Of the 5,400 articles, only 36 answered all 3 questions. So that really shrunk this huge base of literature. Like, who was researching with kids with emotional behavioral disorders? Well, not many. 36 articles included enough people in their samples to say, yes, that really meets the requirement. And of those, these 18 strategies on the slide, or there were 18 strategies, and we've summarized them on these slides. And they went through and even kept doing research as the articles kept coming out, and have republished in 2021. So this has been multiple years where they've kept updating even what has happened. And I have noticed that a few of the items move from promising to evidence-based, or evidence-based to promising practices, because as time goes, new material came in and maybe changed really how it was looked at. So an evidence-based practice means they really see enough research to know that this does what people say it does. A promising practice means there have been studies that show this works, probably more than one, but maybe not enough or with enough children in their studies to say this is absolutely for sure going to be where your bang for the buck is. But all have research behind them, and all are worthwhile. And so when we write our 17 indicators and we provide data, one thing we have to ask is to our special education units across the state, what are you doing? What evidence-based practices are you using? And if you don't know, North Dakota is what's called a local control state, meaning that each special education unit, each school district gets to make up their own policies and guidances. They have to, of course, follow state and federal law, but they can put additional requirements beyond those in a district or whatever. So I, at the state office, can't say you have to do this, but we can say, here's some things we think you should do, or it'd be really great if you would. So every summer, we ask that the special education units across the state and the districts tell us what of these practices are being used to help increase the graduation rate of students with disabilities. And we have gotten such a mix of things. They are using great evidence-based practices, but so much and all over. And it was hard for us to be able to, like we said, one of the ways we're supposed to support them is providing technical assistance or training. And it's hard to provide training if every district is doing tons of different things, at least about some of those topics. So what we decided to do at the state office is select a few of these and be able to go out and provide this training and a support for these practices. They can still use additional practices or those things they were already using, but maybe they will pick up some of these and use them to support. And we can give them tools to implement. We can give them ways to measure if it's being done with fidelity, meaning if it's done consistently and as the research says it should be done. And it's a way for us to be able to give them tools that can collect data to help give to us to measure growth, so that we could just have some standardized supports in place. So out of this list, I will kind of give you a little, we're going to go into three from this list and one from another specifically tonight, but there's some of these that you may not have heard about, but I gave you all of them thinking sometimes it's just, I know some of you may like to dig into and research some of these things. So here's what they are. Tonight, we will talk about check-in, check-out. I think a lot of schools use that use it a lot already. I think the practices we picked, I would say, are being used in schools and being used quite frequently already. But our question was, are they being used for the right students and with fidelity, with progress monitoring happening? So that's what we're working with the schools on. So number two is under evidence-based is functional assessment-based intervention. So like last time we talked about how you're creating that like a functional behavioral assessment. That's kind of what those are. Number three is group contingencies, meaning that you put in place, like sometimes classrooms have a secret student of the day, where a teacher puts a name in an envelope in the morning, and then without telling any kids throughout the whole day, if that kid does a good job during the day of following the rules, the whole class gets a reward or a point or something in their class system. There are pros and cons to group contingencies.
I like that.
Because you may know that some students, that could also be a trigger. So with all of these, we have to think smartly about how we're doing them. Number four is peer-mediated interventions, meaning peers can help be a coach or a reminder to other students about things. Sometimes peers know those things that might trigger a student and can just give a gentle reminder. Then 6 is self-regulated strategy development for writing. They have one for math and for reading as well. It was interesting to me that writing is what popped up in the evidence-based list. They were researched separately. And it's basically a strategy around how you teach the reading, writing, and math instruction. I would imagine we will start seeing the reading and math maybe show up later. High probability request means you're going to ask them to do things at times when there is, the possibility of triggers, or when you're starting to see a student become frustrated. A high probability request is one of those things you can ask them to do that is easy for them, and odds are they're going to be successful. Like you'd have to give them a 99% rate of success. So if I ask them to do that, they're going to be really successful, feel accomplished. Then I can maybe eventually move on to something that's going to be a little harder and may give an opportunity for failure. instructional choice. And these sound basic and easy, but sometimes being able to not here's what you have to do right now, but hey, we have some time and I need to either see you do this or this. What did you like to do? Just having some control there. So some of the promising practices we're going to talk about today are the first two that we're going to talk about. And they actually, at one point, we're under the evidence-based list now, our promising practices. But behavior-specific praise, I think this is probably the most easy one to implement at home, and we will go through and define it and give you some resources around it. And then opportunities to respond. And I'm not going to go into these a lot because, like I said, we'll touch on them again here soon. Behavior contracting, again, working out with the student in advance. What are our goals? How are we going to accomplish this? What's in place if things go sideways? Cooperative learning, again, being able to work with others, make some choices. Goal setting, very powerful in letting the child have control of what am I going to work on, how am I going to get there, and letting them track their own data. I worked in a school where we did goal setting for everything. We did it in a kind of a continuous improvement model. So the kids would set goals, the kids would track their data. We would have like data review meetings, and the kids would then decide what needed to change or what needed to continue. It was a very powerful strategy when they have a voice in it. The good behavior game is another it's another class kind of reward system activity. There is online, you can Google it, and there is some training and information around it. Works really well for students, especially with social, emotional, behavioral. Self-determination, and again, being able to have some control over yourself and your choices. Just social skills instruction as a whole can be a promising practice. And there's what they call a timeout, and it's not just going and sitting somewhere with nothing to do. It again is kind of a procedure, one with procedures, rules, and shaping of instruction around it. So even though we knew that this whole list was great and love to teach in everything, we can't teach in everything well. And we know that if schools are going to start taking some of these things and moving them into the school, they need time to be able to build the system to make sure they're doing it consistently and with fidelity. Fidelity is a big word in anything with behavioral response or with any kind of intervention being implemented. Like, we don't just want to do it and do it sometimes. We want to know we're doing it consistently the same way on over a good period of time. That's kind of that fidelity. So again, today we're going to focus in on the check-in, check-out, behavior-specific praise, and opportunities to respond. And when I say opportunities to respond, I'll tell you more about it. But the reason it says teacher-directed is because when more than teachers or parents, like, there's lots of people who can give opportunities to respond. We could have a parent directed, we could have a peer directed. The one that the research focused on was from the teacher. And so we'll talk about that. But then I did give you the citation for those researchers and the articles of how they went from those 5,000 articles down to the ones you saw today. And there's a citation for it. It is online through research journals. There is a cost to download it. If you ever need or would like to read the copy of the research article and you can't find a place you can get it, I will happily send it to you. I do have the copy as well. So then we also wanted to look within the Department of Public Instruction and see what's already being done. And so one of our offices of education, equity, and support and improvement has already been recommending a program called Check and Connect. And so there's a citation with the research behind that also includes research for students with emotional or behavioral disorders. Check and Connect. So the other things I'm sharing with you are strategies really you can do without any curriculum that any teacher or parent or person could implement without any supplies for the most part. But Check and Connect is a program that a school would purchase that does some of the similar things. Check and Connect, as you might have heard, and Check In, Check Out are really kind of similar, but Check and Connect comes with some additional training and stuff as you purchase the program. So I don't know how familiar many of you are with the multi-tiered systems of support, but that basically means that we create school-wide interventions kind of in a tiered structure. It typically takes the form of a pyramid or a pie wedge. But the goal is that when we have interventions in place, we are hoping that the green tier is something we implement school-wide. Everybody gets it. And ideally, this is going to work and be successful for 80 to 85% of students. But then there's going to be some students who these interventions aren't enough for them to progress in the core curriculum. So they may move to the yellow level. In a school, this may often look like kids who are pulled out for like a social skills group or a reading or a math intervention. This is typically before you get to a special education referral. This is maybe in the range where you're just doing some of those interventions in the school. Ideally, the yellow range is about 15% of students. So if your school system of intervention is done correctly, you will see that 80% of your students fall kind of in that green level. 15% are in the middle tier. And red is where we're starting to get to. Red can include students without an IEP, but by the time we're getting up toward red, that's where a Section 504 IEP referral is probably going to come. And that should be 3 to 5% of our students that would need this level of support. So what I did was put the interventions into the tier based on how they're described in the research or how they describe themselves from the groups that research them. So opportunities to respond and behavior-specific praise ideally can happen at all student level. Check-in, check-out describes themselves more in that mid-range intervention. And interestingly enough, the Check-in Connect, which is the program, describes themselves falling between the yellow and the red. But some people have said, well, that's interesting because you guys are talking about special ed students, but these practices you pick truthfully fall before special education. Yes. I mean, we'd love to see them implemented school-wide and with fidelity so that these students maybe don't ever have to fall into interventions or special education. That would be our dream. And hopefully that can take place. We know that's going to take some time. But these also still work, as the research shows, with these students who are identified as having those social emotional behaviors and who have been put on an IEP. So I mean, if we can do it with those students with fidelity and we could get these in place and it would also maybe stop some referrals, what a bonus that could be. So that's our hopes, and that's kind of how they fit in our system. So the first one we're going to do, and in the slides, there'll be links to all these sites. Most of what you'll get today comes from some of the national technical assistance centers. So these are people who receive federal funds and do support special education in schools. And there's some really good resources in here if you have time to dig into them. So behavior-specific praise. Well, it's something I think all of us do as a human being without knowing we do it. So it's a positive statement or praise to a child that acknowledges a desired behavior that is specific, observable, and measurable. So you would explicitly state the behavior that you were doing that you wanted done at home. So I will show you some examples of exactly what that is, but there's an article I linked here on how to use behavior-specific praise at home. And there's a fundamental skill sheet that tells you exactly like how best it's implemented. If you haven't heard of the IRIS Center, they have a website. It is through Vanderbilt University, and they do a lot of stuff around behavioral intervention and have some free online training modules as well. So instead of just saying thank you, you might say, thank you for sharing your toys with your sister. I love seeing you two play together. And it sounds kind of silly, but it in their head helps connect. Hey, they liked it when I shared. And the way we can know that it's observable, we know it's observable because you could watch him share the toy. You told him what that happened. You shared the toy. It's measurable that you could see that it happened. So I appreciate you wiping off the counter after you made your lunch. That's something very specific I could see and know that you did it. I think sometimes, and I find myself doing this, and I try to remind myself even at home with my own child, is like you just do a quick thanks or thank you. And sometimes remembering just to add that extra part of it, like, what am I thankful for? What did I see happen? Or I noticed you did this. I really like that. because we do it, like, right? There are many times we do this exact thing and we don't always think about it. So on this page is linked also the fidelity measure. It's a very basic chart, very basic. You'd open it up and you're like, wow, this is it. But it really is saying, did you make the comment after the behavior happened? Were you specific and measurable? And it's just like a yes, no. So we encourage that this is something like a teacher could even just record themselves, like doing a lesson, and go back and listen and say, did I do those things? And if they did, mark it off and keep a self-tally that way. There's also a tip sheet linked here about how to remember, tips for remembering giving it, that was done by the Council for Exceptional Children. One of the best ways I've ever heard about measuring it is to think about maybe in an evening with your child, how many times do you hope you'd use this behavior specific praise, and give yourself a goal and create a number. They talk about even putting something like paper clips or a little something you could put in one of your pockets. And every time you give your child behavior specific praise, moving a paper clip to the other pocket. So going from left to right. And at the end of the night, you could count how many you have. Or we say for a teacher, if your lessons go in half-hour increments, how many per half hour do you hope you give? Especially if we're targeting toward a specific student who has like an emotional behavioral disorder. How many times do you think per half hour you should praise them? And then you can move those paper clips over and at the end, count it and record it. The thing we talked about like last time when we met was that we have students who may be exhibiting like behaviors seeking, like they might be seeking attention seeking behaviors. It might be for negative attention. Well, we need to replace that with positive attention. That is what this is. So if a child is typically like blurting out or trying to get negative attention every 10 minutes, then our behavior specific praise needs to come faster than every 10 minutes. It might need to be every 8 minutes, every 5 minutes. This is a way to hopefully use a positive behavior to replace that negative attention seeking behavior. And if at any point you guys have questions, you just hop right in and yell out. I'm in a hotel, so I don't have as much screen space, so I may not see the chat, but yell out, let me know, or interrupt me, that's fine. So our second strategy is opportunities to respond. And we picked the teacher directed. Like I said, a peer in theory can ask for a response. This is essentially asking for a response from a child. This could be done with peers or with parents, but our focus has been opportunities to respond that are teacher directed. I feel like as parents, we do this, but we aren't trying. This is really about keeping a kid engaged in an activity that could lose their attention. I know there are times we have to do that as parents. It may not be as frequent as a child in a classroom having to do academic tasks. So this looks like giving a child frequent chances to answer questions or prompts in a set amount of time. And then the teacher can provide some feedback. The theory is that we're frequently asking them for input. And so they have to pay attention to be ready to provide those answers back. So it helps them to become less off task or disruptive. And it's there's a process the teachers need to plan for when doing this. Like you're going to want to have some questions or prompts ready. I feel like it would be really hard to do just off the cuff creating an activity or a lesson, because you have to have a very frequent pace of asking for feedback. The teacher can choose different methods to ask questions of the students. We'll talk about some of those. They choose the method for how the student will respond. And they're going to ask a minimum. This is the part that I know I did this as a teacher, but I did not meet the minimum, because they're saying we should do 3 questions per minute, pretty much, of keeping the child engaged. I don't think I did that many. I would have to really work on it, I think, and really be thoughtful about it. And then the teacher can also provide feedback on the student answers. But the other part of this one is that we have to explicitly teach to the students or children how this process is going to go. Like, for example, and we see this happening in classrooms already. Most classroom teachers do what they call think, pair, share, which means that We might ask a question, the students think about it for like 30 seconds. Then they pair off, often having like, they call them shoulder buddies or knee to knee buddies, where you turn and talk to your partner. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I was an elementary teacher, so that's where my examples go. I don't always think about the bigger kids, but oftentimes your think, pair, share means you're pairing 2 of you or 3 of you up, you share your ideas, and then you may come back to the group and maybe a few will share out or maybe all will. I think we do this a lot at trainings we go to for work or in the community. It gives the teachers opportunities to vary responses. It also allows us to assess how the students are doing toward that information. But to me, some of the really great parts of opportunities to respond for including kids with disabilities in a classroom is that we can build into here how they respond. We can create accommodations. We can allow additional processing time. We can add sentence starters. So for example, for a kid who might struggle with how to respond, like, I mean, sometimes, right, our anxiety, it's like, oh, if we have to respond, we can respond as a whole group, meaning everybody does a choral answer, we all yell it out. We could have sentence starters. The teacher gives you a sheet that says, I think this because, and they just fill in a blank, or I disagree because. There's been some amazing different sentence starter lists about how to have like real scientific or research-based discussions where you say, I agree with you because, or I disagree, and here's why, or even ones that have the spots where you quote the text from what they've been working on. And the other part I really liked about this is that I get to work in the office where I have done some work with our English. I get to work with where the line of where English language learners crosses special ed a little bit. And so I've gotten to work with some of our English language learner teachers in the state, but I've also gotten to do some national trainings on that crossroad. But what I've learned is that when we're talking about learning language, and whether you're learning a new language, or I would say even learning more about our language, is that the way to learn it is that you need to speak it, listen it, read it, and write it in every activity you do. This opportunities to respond gives kids opportunities where they could do those all easily within each lesson. They could speak it by sharing with their buddy or yelling it out loud in a response. They can listen to others speaking as they pair with their buddies. They can read it by sometimes giving just written choices. Some teachers have like a variety of little pre-made answer cards on your table. And so when they say a question and they say, which one is, it's just holding up a flashcard that already has the answer on it. So it might just be reading that word or reading a sentence. And they can write. I mean, we've all seen in classrooms now where they have the little white dry erase boards and you write your answer and hold it up. But there's some really great feedback for teachers on if these kids are, you know, or I think of as sometimes, like, especially on these online trainings, it's thumbs up if you agree with this. It is stand up out of your chair, or like, if you feel like the sky is blue, stand up. If you feel like the sky is yellow, sit down. And you can just do quick things like that that are tied to whatever lesson you're teaching. So when they are giving these opportunities to respond, where they're asking the academic questions that are relevant to the lesson they're learning, it has to be important and applicable to the student for them to really stay engaged. They have to have a variety and unpredictability when they're asking those questions. That way it kind of keeps you on your toes, that you can be called on at any time. And again, for kids with disabilities, we know that, like myself, I had anxiety of when that teacher would call on you in class and what if I don't know the answer? This is not meant to be targeted. It's not meant to call out student knowledge. Ideally, it's often the whole group answering at the same time so that there's some levels of security. It's not supposed to be a punishment or to catch anybody off guard. It's really to just stimulate that interest and challenge the class. And we want to keep it at kind of a brisk pace, but we can also allow, if we know a child needs that processing time, that into this process as well. The other part is that we have to make sure that all students are provided that opportunity to respond, that we're not calling on the students who are actively at, like, you know, the me kids all the time. So sometimes being the whole group answers allow that as well. And then we can use the accuracy of what those students are telling you, like even holding up dry erase boards. Some teachers do hold it in front of you, which means other kids probably cannot see the answer, but a teacher standing in front of them can see what it says. So as part of our guidance on these, our federal technical assistance centers say if the teacher is seeing that their accuracy is less than 80% for new material, or less than 90% if it's material that's already been taught and reviewed, that it's a time then the teacher needs to shake up instruction, reteach, or provide some additional supports. So it's a great way to also find out if the kids are understanding what you have presented. So again, you will see the IRIS Center has some great resources on the opportunities to respond. So the first one is that fidelity checklist. It's a simple checklist, but it gives you a way that you can also measure by what you check if you're getting to better and able to implement it consistently and more correctly. So it gives you a measure of, are you improving? But on classroomcheckup.org is an opportunity on how to do a classroom checkup and increase those opportunities to respond. And then there's also another article around goal setting of how to increase answers and opportunities. So then I think one that you guys may be the most familiar with, but maybe I'm wrong, is check in and check out. I think I'd say I bet we've hit in almost every school that this is happening, at least for some students. So how does check in and check out work? Well, these are for students who may need some behavioral reinforcement throughout their day. And it often looks like a student meeting with a coach or a mentor in the morning to set a goal for the day. Often these goals are tied around a behavior intervention plan or some interventions that are in place with the student or instruction in an area of need. So the best practice is, this was another one of those surprising things for me, because I did do check in, check out in my classroom a lot. But oftentimes the check-in or check-out was with myself or some of the paraprofessionals in the classroom, when they say the best practice from the research is actually to be with somebody who is not a case manager or a teacher of the child. So somebody the child doesn't see all the time, somebody who is not responsible for giving the child a grade or really having any authority. I say not any authority over the student. I mean, all teachers and staff in a building have responsibility to the student, but not directly responsible to having to make a child do something all the time. And that was really interesting to me. And I do see some bonus in that. And I did have a student who in an elementary school, 90% of the teachers are usually female. And I had a little guy who just fell in love with the custodian who was male, and he was his check-in, check-out partner. And it was really a really great connection. Probably for this reason too, and that having that male role model was great, but it was also somebody who had he never had to really provide the consequences or provide any correction to the student. So he was a really good mentor. Oftentimes you will see that the child meets with somebody in the morning and you set a goal for the day. The child often has like a point card, a smile chart, a progress chart that's used throughout the school day. Then they will meet again with this coach or mentor at the end of the day. Or if this is a child who needs more frequent reinforcement to reinforce those positive behaviors, I had sometimes done where we checked in with the student in the middle at lunchtime. Sometimes it was maybe a mid-morning, a lunch, and an early afternoon, and then at the end of the day, depending on how often they need that. Some students may earn some kind of reinforcer, at every check-in. And that might be tied to some of that intervention. And then oftentimes this point sheet goes home, and we hope that you are working out with the school and the school is involving you in, here's how this behavior plan is, here's how we're doing check-in, check-out, here's what all of this chart means, here's ways you could reinforce it at home. Or here's discussions you can have, with your child about how their goal setting went and what could change if needed. So I saw this visual kind of the check-in, check-out cycle. It seems a little bit more complicated than it sounds, but again, you're starting this process. They do a morning check-in. Their regular teacher gives feedback often marking their charts, whether it's a regular teacher or paraprofessional. You may do your midday, or maybe it's the end of the school day check-in. The chart goes home where the parents can provide feedback. And then you're back to the next morning for check-in, but you're always making sure that at some point you stop and go over to the other side and look at that side process of you've collected the data for so many weeks. And you're looking at that student progress. And if the student made progress and it's where you expected, or they've been able to maintain progress, you might exit the program. If the student is progressing, but you need more time to keep it going, that's great too. But if it's not working, then we might need to revise the program and then go through and try the whole cycle again. So I put in some examples of point sheets, and being that I often give all my examples about young elementary, because that is my niche, I did pick 2 point sheets that are a little more aimed toward the middle school level. Oftentimes it's going to give you like your different subjects of the day. It's going to have you rate in like a 3, 2, 1. For elementary, it often looks like a happy face, a sad face. Or maybe you have some of those great teachers who love what, like, wants to invest with your kids' interest areas, and all of a sudden you have a Minecraft point chart or a Mario point chart. But here's some things we need to think about with these point charts. Is that your child sets a goal for the day. Is there a spot to write your goal on the chart, or has the goal been defined somewhere in the chart? That's helpful. And then the other part is we need the student, the parent, and the teachers to all understand what behavior are we measuring. And last time we talked about how the behaviors need to be clearly defined. Instead of saying the child needs to be respectful, what does that look like? What would you see to say, yes, this child's being respectful? So for example, like on this chart, it does say respectful and responsible. And these were ones I pulled off a website. Nowhere on the chart do I see really defined what does respectful mean, what does responsible mean. I might want to make sure, if it's not defined on here, that there's another paper somewhere where we have that. If it's a child who needs visuals to remember, for some of my cards that we've used over the years, like we took a picture of a student being responsible. Like to him, that means I'm cleaning up my desk or I'm doing this. So we take a picture that reminded him of one of those things and put it on here. Some kids can do okay with pictures, like clip art type pictures from your computer. Some need pictures of themselves doing something because that's more clear to them to what it means. Some can have just words written on the card reminding them that this is what it means. But my only concern with this one was that those words are so little abstract if you haven't defined. And many schools have what they call as a positive behavioral intervention support program across the whole school. So as a school, they may have already defined and may throughout the whole school year teach, this is what respectful looks like. This is what this looks like. I know that I can walk into a few different school districts around the state and it even says, here's what respectful looks like in the bathroom. Here's what respectful looks like in the lunchroom. Here's what respectful looks like in a classroom. And if the school has defined it that clearly, then maybe no additional instruction is needed. Unless having to know that across all of those environments is too confusing for the child, then maybe we need to, find some cues or tone it down. So then we not only need to know what these mean, but we need to know what does a 2, a 1, and a 0 mean. Like on this chart or on the other one looks to have a similar system. Or if we're doing a happy face, a sad face, and a like straight lined mouth face. What do those 3 mean? What happens that makes a child get a 3 versus a 2 versus a 1? Or like here, a 2, a 1, or a 0? Do they know what moves them to each of those numbers? Ideally, if the system's going to be successful, we kind of need to know those different levels. But the interesting part is, so remember how we talked about those through that colored triangle, that when this was implemented at that tier, that yellow tier 2 level, so this is before special education, when it was done with specific students who needed it, but done consistently every day, with all of that defined, done with a person, a check-in, and a coach who was not a teacher of theirs, and done with fidelity, meaning every day the same, consistently sent home, all that check in, check out was 70 to 75% effective for students, meaning they'd seen a reduction in problem behavior, there was increased academic engagement, and there was increased pro-social, which means positive behavior. So, I mean, what a success that if we can make sure we are doing it. And sometimes I've seen that any kid is struggling in school and like giving them a point chart can be a great solution. And it can be, as long as we make sure that we've also taught the student what this is about. And in my opinion, and on my ideal range, the students involved in creating the chart, helping to select those reinforcers and feedback, helping to create the goals, because when they have buy-in, it just works better. It's their program and they care about it. So again, here's a whole collection of resources for you. Check in, check out. An article on it. PBIS means Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. That's a big kind of school-wide system. And it's our Technical Assistance Center for that. There's some more articles about how to use it as intervention with the rewards, and just some different groups so that have done research articles or have strategies to share. So I included them as well as another fidelity measure to know how are you implementing it consistently. So then this one is probably not as likely to be used in your home, other than it may be a child of yours coming home with. So this is Check and Connect, which is similar to Check In and Check Out, but this is the program. So your district buys the program. It is a more structured intervention, but again, you'll see those same kind of components that we just talked about. They have a mentor, they do a check-in in the morning, and then they connect later in the day to review that data of how did it go, usually with a point sheet. Or the bonus of this program is that it comes with an online app and teachers can literally enter point stuff into like a device, and you get graphs and stuff really nicely, really quickly. The student, and I think parents can maybe get a login to see those graphs as well. There is a family engagement component where they have training and supports for families. And so again, it's focusing on what are those variables that we can change to build a relationship. It's got that personalized data for the student and we're customizing the intervention to them. These guys suggest a long-term commitment, meaning you implement Check and Connect for a minimum of 2 years, and that there's participation with the school. They can help problem solve and build capacity of staff. And they have something called Persistence Plus, which is really working to ensure that there's consistency among the adults involved, that they build the system to work with the families, and that it remains consistent. The other part of Check and Connect is that they do use cognitive behavioral therapy strategies, which have been shown to be very proven effective for students with emotional disturbance. Is that oftentimes if you went to see a family counselor or psychiatrist, they would use cognitive behavioral therapy strategies. So again, some resources on that. I won't stay here too long because if you were in my last training, this looks familiar. Language to me is still a huge component. As we know that language is a base of many disability categories, autism, emotional, like we see that with emotional disturbance, that there's language needs. Children identify as speech language impairment because of language. And so I just have this belief of how it impacts all of those areas so greatly. And then how do we support language in schools? Are we using enough visuals? Do we just only put things in words? Do we need sentence starters? Do we need processing time? You know, even so many of our behavioral responses in schools are great. I do enjoy restorative justice, which means like instead of being a consequence or punishment for when a behavior goes wrong, you sit down and meet with those who you might have wronged in the behavior and talk through the behavior. That is a really great strategy and I really do love it. But for some kids with language struggles, talking through and listening needs support. Even the cognitive behavioral therapy does rely on a lot of self-talk, teaching kids to say things to themselves. If language is a struggle, there needs to be some extra supports even for self-talk. So a study done found, so they did a study of students who had left school and were identified as having ED, and they screened them to see if they had a language impairment later in life after being out of school. And 97% of the children in their study were found to have language impairments. And of those 97, 81% of them were never identified in school as having a language impairment. Partially because kids sometimes exhibiting behaviors are harder to evaluate. Then I gave you a whole collection here of different program guides and resources. Some of these are some of our national intervention centers that really can help provide some great information for you. I gave you all the articles and research that we use to write this. And then I will give you time if you have questions. We're right on the dot. But as you guys ask questions, I'm going to pop this up, and whether you do it now or as you get a copy of the slides as they come out, as part of our 17 federal indicators, I have to report on the technical assistance I provided. And this anonymous survey with no links to any of you specifically gives us information as to, one, that people attended the trainings, and two, your feedback provides information on if it's working or things we can change. And we do report, here's things that went well, and here's things that we'll tweak to change next time. So this input helps with that. With that, I am done. I'm sorry we're late, and I'll answer questions or hang out as you guys are done.
I think that's awesome, Michelle. You do such a nice job. I wish you would have been my teacher. I'm gonna stop the